Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Camp Prosperity session. We're going to get started in a minute, but in the meantime, please watch this short video from Prosperity Now on baby bonds.
Their race or socioeconomic status, they would have a fair shot at the American dream. To know that at age 18, instead of being saddled with debt, they would have a nest egg to pursue a college education, start a business.
Hello again, and welcome to our first session for Camp Prosperity, Mapping Influence, Understanding Who and How to Engage for Change. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items with you all. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to registrants and available online within 1 week. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. We hope that you will ask questions throughout the webinar, and you can do so by typing into the text box of your GoToWebinar control panel under questions. And if you experience any technical difficulties or issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. And to make sure that you're getting the most out of today's call, we recommend that you join from a quiet space, grab a coffee, water, or snack, and settle in and engage with us. Send us your questions and comments as you listen. You can also tweet along with us during today's webinar using the hashtag #CampProsperity. We also recommend that you reflect on ways to apply what you learned today to your own work. And with that, I'll kick things over to my colleague, Vanna.
Great, thank you so much, Dara. Welcome to Camp Prosperity, everyone. As some of you know, this is our 4th year hosting this series, and we designed it to help build the advocacy skills of our network of state-based organizations and to be able to connect you all to a broader network of advocates across the country in order to share success stories, some challenges, and share questions related to advocacy. So if you are here for additional advocacy skill building and to connect with other like-minded advocates, then you are in the right place. And hopefully this first webinar in the series will be a good kickoff for you all. As we know, over the last several months, our country has been rocked to the core with the COVID-19 pandemic and the household financial and health challenges brought on by it. We've seen that effective government at every level plays a huge role in the social, economic, and physical well-being of our communities. Now it's more critical than ever that we're equipped, organized, and mobilized to engage legislators and advocate for policies that lead us to a more just future. Next slide, please. So this week, to kick off Camp Prosperity, we're going to focus on mapping influence and understanding who and how to engage. Today's webinar will focus on strategies for navigating the complexities of government. We'll discuss the critical role that nonprofits play in advocacy, share some best practices for effective organizational advocacy, and why it's more important than ever for service providers to engage decision makers at every level. As you all can see on the slide, this is a 3-week virtual learning program, and it's designed for both new and experienced advocates. So for those of you who have been with us the last 4 seasons of Camp Prosperity, welcome back. You all should have received a newsletter yesterday with some additional resources to go along with today's webinar. So each Monday before the Tuesday webinar, we'll send out a newsletter with materials for you all to read over just to prepare you a little bit more for what's going to be discussed on our Tuesday webinar. And you can see on the screen the upcoming webinars that we have over the next several weeks. Next slide, please. Another thing that we try to do on Camp Prosperity is we want it to feel as interactive as possible. We know that we are in a webinar and a virtual setting, but still we want to make this series feel fun. As much as we want you to hear from experts and learn a lot, we want you to enjoy the series. So in order for us to achieve that, we've included several ways for you to win prizes throughout the series. During each session, we'll award a prize to the top tweeter. So please live tweet during today's session if you hear things that you like and you want to share. Use the hashtag Camp Prosperity so that we can see it on Twitter. We will also do a pop quiz at the end of today's session. So pay attention to what's being said. We're going to do a pop quiz. Whoever the first person to answer the question correctly in the comments box or in the chat box will win a prize. And then completing our post-webinar survey will also give you a chance to win a prize. Next slide, please. So today's speakers, we are pleased to be joined by Abby Levine. She is the Director for Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice. If you've been with us in the past on Camp Prosperity, you know that Abby is no stranger to this series. She's back with us again this year to talk a little bit about nonprofits engaging in advocacy. We are also pleased to be joined by Seema Ignani, who is the Executive Director of National Capacity, as well as Rob Randava, who is the Senior Policy Counsel for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We are grateful to our 3 speakers and looking forward to hearing more of their expertise in the series. And in terms of agenda, we're going to do a quick poll question before we get started, and then I'll turn it over to Abby to discuss advocacy for nonprofits. And then we will have a panel discussion with Rob and Seema and talking about mapping influence. Like I said, just diving into the complexities of advocacy and the different parts of government that need to be influenced. Finally, we will open up the floor for group discussion and Q&A. And I will say, you don't have to wait until the end of today's webinar to put your questions in the chat box. Please, throughout today's discussion, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. And so before I turn it over to Abby, I want to ask a quick poll question to see what you all are doing. Have your organization's advocacy efforts changed as a result of the pandemic? So the options here are yes, we are advocating more, yes, we are advocating less, or no, nothing has changed. If you'll take a quick second to answer this poll question for us. All right. I think we can close it and see what we've got here. And it looks like most of you are advocating more, so that's great to hear. And then 28% of you said no, nothing's changed, and 12% of you are saying we are advocating more. So that's a good good way to know who's on today's webinar. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Abby Levine to dive into advocacy for nonprofits. Abby.
Great, thanks so much, Vanna, and it's so nice to be back here at Camp Prosperity. And I wish I had a s'more in front of me, but instead I'll drink my water and some coffee, and really excited about this conversation. For those of you who aren't familiar with Alliance for Justice, we are the nation's leading resource for foundations and nonprofits who want to be active advocates. We provide a lot of resources to help you push for the policies and the issues and to create the better communities that you want to see. We have a lot of resources on our website that talk about the rules in much more detail. But today I want to sort of talk big picture. But if nothing else, I want you to walk away from this session remembering three things. One is that you can do a lot more advocacy than you think. And based on that poll question, I don't think I need to really encourage you of the importance of advocacy. I think you already get that. But one, to know that you can do a lot more advocacy than you think. It is legal, it is appropriate, and it's really important for you to be involved. Second, you're not doing this work alone. You're part of the Prosperity Now network, and there are over 100 of you on this call and lots more who weren't able to join. Take advantage of the resources that are out there, and as whether it's me or Seema, Rob, or other people who will be guest speaking as part of Camp Prosperity, that again, know that there are these resources out there and we are all here to help you do your work better. And then three, know that particularly we at Boulder Advocacy, are here to support you in your work, whether you're pushing for the baby bonds, whether it's looking to get the farm bill passed, whatever the issues that you're working on, we're here as a resource. And we have lots more resources, again, whether it's written resources on our website, we've launched a podcast over the last year, and we also have a free technical assistance hotline staffed by our team of attorneys and advocacy experts that you can reach out to us for follow-up or additional questions. And so again, just know that you're not in this work alone, but that it's so, so important. And if we can go to the next slide. Now, again, I know I don't really need to remind you all of how important advocacy is, but I will, just to really make sure to keep it all fresh. The last year has been a challenging year for the communities you work in, for your organizations, and it's because of advocacy, even, dare I say, lobbying, that many of your organizations, many of your partner organizations are still here doing this work. What you see on the screen is some snippets from an article that was in the Chronicle of Philanthropy a few weeks ago, talking about how most nonprofits emerged from the pandemic wounded, but still operating, and really talk about it due to the lobbying success of some of the economic stimulus bills that were passed, particularly the Paycheck Protection Program. And I know for many of the organizations that I'm involved with, that law and the benefits that came from it were crucial. So not only is advocacy really important, but it also makes a difference. I was also, and you can see where I spend my time reading, but there was another article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy just today that the headline says, "The pandemic reveals the importance of advocacy to a food charity," and talks about how an organization in Philadelphia that changed how it operated during the pandemic, but ended up stronger, and talked about how it needed to make and weigh in on some changes to change how local food systems operate, but that it really was able to allow them to do their work even better. So again, advocacy matters, and we see it in all, sort of everywhere where we're operating. And if we go to the next slide, people often wonder, well, what about nonprofits? Or, why aren't our policymakers doing what we want them to do? Don't they know what we need? And it's really important and this I just thought was such a good reminder, that policymakers, while they know a lot they don't necessarily know everything. And this is, I just thought, a great snippet from a Facebook page from several years ago, but from Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, responding to and commenting on a phone call he got from a constituent. And he says in this message, I wouldn't have known about this particular problem if Sarah, his constituent, had not gotten in touch with us. I love how he then says, I introduced legislation today that will fix the problems. If only it were that easy, and it would make Rob's and Seema's and Vanna's jobs so much easier if that's all it took, were one phone call. But again, it just reinforces that we need to be, that you're the experts on what's going on in your community. And so it's really important that you're weighing in, not assuming that policymakers know everything, and that we're both resources for them and often lift up and make them focus on issues that they may not want to talk about. But if we go to the next slide, this is really where we get into the guts of what you can do as a nonprofit. And nonprofit organizations are allowed to advocate. I know there is so much confusion and misunderstanding about what organizations can do. And too often, lawyers that represent organizations, the accountants who work with organizations, or funders who support organizations don't fully understand the rules, and in an abundance of caution often say, oh, this is scary, don't do it. While there are some rules that you need to follow, that's what we're here for at Boulder Advocacy, and we can help you through the rules and help you get to yes in most instances to be able to do the work that you want to do. What I really encourage everyone to think about is, what is the risk if you're not part of the conversation, if you're not at the table? And thinking about everything that's happened over the last year with the pandemic, with the racial police violence, the conversations about racial equity, that it's really important for organizations like yours to be part of those conversations. And so there's so much that you can do. Most of you on today's call are with 501c3 organizations. And if you want to know more about the different types of tax-exempt organizations and what all the different types of organizations can do, call me. You'll get my contact information and we can talk in much more detail. But what I want to highlight is that advocacy encompasses so many types of activities, and probably more than you even think. While lobbying is a type of advocacy, advocacy is so much broader than that. While supporting candidates or getting involved in elections is a type of advocacy, advocacy is much broader than that. And there is so much activity that we as 501c3 organizations can do, whether it's building relationships with policymakers, whether it's filing lawsuits, whether it's encouraging corporations to raise their own minimum wage or to treat workers better, whether it's encouraging people to get out to vote, whether it's organizing to find out what's important to people in communities and what are the solutions that people want. Those are all types of advocacy that we as 501c3 organizations can do. Most of us can even lobby. Yes, there are some limits to how much lobbying we can do, and essentially lobbying is supporting or opposing specific legislation. So if you listen to the video or watch the video and said, I'm going to call my senator and tell them to support the bill about baby bonds, that would be lobbying, but for most of us, we can do it. So again, while you may often hear, oh, lobbying, you're not really supposed to do it, you can do it. And we can talk you through, particularly for your organization, with how big it is and sort of what types of grants you may have. We're happy to sort of help you think through how you can do what you want to do. The other piece so in addition to talking about that, you can engage in advocacy. It's also important to recognize that there's not one right approach to how you do it. Every organization on this call may tackle some of these boxes and not others. Some organizations may have lobbyists on staff, others and most probably don't. Some organizations may engage in litigation, others may not. You don't have to do everything. It's really important for you and your organization to figure out what you can do now, what makes sense based on the resources that you have, based on the mission of your organization, and to do that. And I think, and that gets to another piece, that we don't do advocacy just to do it. We do advocacy because it's a tool to accomplish our missions, to fulfill our goals. And so again, when you think about, do we engage in advocacy, it's always important to think about, one, what does it mean and what does it look like to engage in advocacy, but then to think about why we're doing it. And if we go to the next slide, I want to be really clear that, and if we go to the next slide, that even our funder, and you can just click through these, that even funders can engage in advocacy. I know there are some community foundations on the call today, whether it's Foundation for Louisiana or a community foundation in Buffalo. Community foundations are also 501c3 organizations, and you can lobby as well. Again, there are limits. The limits are pretty generous, and you can lobby. You can lobby directly. You can even make re-grant or make grants to other organizations to lobby. Private foundations, entities like the Marguerite Casey Foundation or the Anna E. Casey Foundation or the Ford Foundation, can also support the advocacy work that you do. They're subject to some additional rules in terms of lobbying, but there's so much that you can do that's part of that big A advocacy that you can do and that they can fund. So again, it's all about figuring out how. And again, that's what we at Alliance for Justice are here to help you with. And then finally, if we go to the next slide, and I know Rob and Seema are going to talk a lot more about how to get started. And for organizations that have not done a lot of advocacy or really thinking about how to ramp up their advocacy, they're going to provide a lot of tips and strategies. We also have some resources on our website, including our advocacy capacity tool. And there's a long version, there's a quick version that really lays out what some of the core capacities are that effective advocates have. And you can use these tools to get a snapshot of what your organization's current strengths are, what your gaps are, and use that to help you think through what might be possible now, who to partner with, what kind of questions to ask or capacity building you want. But the goal of all of this is that you're not, as I started with, you're not doing this work alone. Prosperity Now and their network is there to support you. We at Alliance for Justice are here to support your work, and all of the other people who are on this call or show that we're really in this together. And so let me stop now, turn it over for questions. But as you hear about, and as Seema and Rob talk about all of the advocacy work that they're doing, know that it's legal, you can do it, and if you're not sure how in your organization, call us and we'll get you on your way. So thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. And I wanted to pause here really quickly before we turn it over to our panel discussion with Seema and Rob and see if folks had specific questions for Abby. Anything that you may be grappling with at your organization that you'd like more clarity on. I'm going to allow a few minutes just for questions for Abby. And I see a question here from Jody, Abby, and I think a lot of people wonder this a lot. Where does the advocacy line end and lobbying line begin?
So that's a great question, and it's one, I'm a lawyer, so it could take me hours to answer that question. But the essential part when we're talking about what lobbying is that we're talking about supporting or opposing specific legislation. And so one sort of a quick way to answer that is, if the policy change that you want doesn't require legislation, it's probably not lobbying at all. And so if the policy change you want is through a court decision, it won't be lobbying. If you want the president to issue an executive order, not lobbying. If you want HHS or the Department of Homeland Security to issue regulations or to change their program and how they operate, not lobbying. So again, one of the ways when we think about what's lobbying is if something needs to go through the legislative process, it may be lobbying. And if it doesn't go through the legislature, it's not lobbying at all. And then even then, if it does go through the legislature, again, we need to be really communicating about that specific bill. And there's a lot more nuance to it that I'm happy to take more questions on later, or we have lots more resources on our website. But so much of the work that you do, even having conversations with policymakers where it's not lobbying. And so, and if you have questions about whether the work that you're doing is lobbying, know that you can call us and we're happy to talk that through with you.
Great, thanks, Abby. And I have one more question I'm going to ask. And David, I see your question here. I'm going to save that for Seema and Rob, for Seema and Rob's discussion. And then I see a few people are asking for the ACT tool as well as the hotline. I posted that in the chat for you all as well. But a second question for you here, Abby, is how about signing on to Congress or state legislative letters for 501c3s? Can we participate?
Sure, so that's a great question. So signing on to letters to Congress or to state legislatures. So a lot of it will depend on what the letter says. If you are signing on to a letter asking legislators to support and vote for the baby bonds bill, for instance, that would be lobbying. For most organizations, however, when we think about how much lobbying we can do, we're thinking about how much money we're spending on lobbying. And so it may be, if you have a staff person that spends a lot of their time lobbying, that might add up. But if you're signing on to a letter, and how much money does it cost you to do that? And that's one of the great parts of being in networks and being part of associations, that you're not doing all the work yourself. And so if Rob at the leadership conference is writing a letter and asking groups to sign on, he's done much of the work. He may have to count more time as lobbying, but for you, it would be the time you read it, the time you decide. So again, even though something may constitute lobbying, that's not the end of the question. Or that's not the end of the story. There are things that we may say, yeah, technically that's lobbying, but ultimately, that's fine. So what? And so again, don't panic if something you're doing is lobbying. You want to know when you're doing something that's lobbying so you can track it. But again, that's what we're here for, and we can help talk through more specific examples.
Great, thank you so much for that, Abby, and thank you for those thoughtful questions from the audience. I'm going to move us along here so that we'll have about 30 minutes to go through our panel discussion this afternoon. But before we do so, I'm going to skip back to the poll question that we just skipped. I want to give Seema and Rob an idea of who we have on the call in terms of experience level. So if you all will take a quick second to just fill out this second poll question on what types of advocacy you've engaged in. All right, I think we can display the responses here. Well, we are all over the board here, but it looks like most of you all have, 73% of you have emailed a legislator, half of you have called a legislator and attended a town hall meeting. I guess signed a petition is the highest one at 80%. And then about 35% of you have attended an in-person meeting. So that's great. We've got experience across the board. So with that, I want to dive into our panel discussion this afternoon. We are very pleased to have Seema and Rob on with us this afternoon. to discuss a little bit more about just navigating the complexities of government. One of the things that we often hear from our network here at Prosperity Now, as much as we talk about legislative advocacy, emailing a legislator, calling a legislator, we don't often talk about how committees work or other types of advocacy, regulatory, budgetary advocacy. So we wanted to take this particular session to dive a little bit deeper into that and talk to our panelists about what that work looks like, as well as just offering up some general tips and best practices for you all. So I am going to dive into our panel questions here. And I think the first question that I have is going to be for Seema. And Seema, before you answer my first question, I want you to sort of introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your work at National Capacity. But the question that I have for you, Seema, is, knowing, prior to DC, you were doing community work, like many of our attendees here on today's webinar. When you're not in DC, I know that influencing people here in DC can feel a little bit intimidating. Talk a little bit about that perspective and how you learned to navigate the complexities of government.
Sure, thank you, Vanna, for having me here today. My name is Seema Agnani. I'm the Executive Director of National Capacity. We're a coalition of about 100 local organizations working on housing and economic justice issues. As Vanna alluded to, I previously worked with one of our member organizations based in Queens, New York, doing housing counseling, financial capability, and many other issues. So, I've been in Washington, D.C. now for 6 years and have learned quite a bit in the shift from local to national. And I think, really hoping I can share some of my learnings over the last 6 years with you all today. It's definitely a culture shift going from local advocacy work to national. And I think, the most important thing I would want to drive home that I heard Abby say as well is really trust that you are an expert and your perspective really is critical for those working on the national level to hear. I think one thing I've really continued to learn is that many of those who design policy here in DC, either haven't been in local community in a very long time or have never been in some cases. And so, don't assume that folks that you're working with on the Hill or even in the administration necessarily have that history. So I think it's really important to, set the context when you're talking to people, make sure they understand who your community is and some of the complexities that they may face that might be unique. Some of the other things that happen in DC is, a lot of acronyms, language that takes a minute to understand. And so I've always felt it's my responsibility to ask questions. So, I think it's really important not to feel foolish asking what somebody is saying when they use an acronym or say something you don't understand. It's important to remind people to pull over and explain, what exactly they are trying to communicate to you. I think the pace here in Washington, D.C. is pretty fast. And so, it's okay to slow it down, ask the right questions, and make sure, you trust your own perspective in knowing what your communities need. I think the example that Abby shared was a good one because very often, folks on the Hill don't hear from local constituents enough. And so it really, the importance of doing advocacy couldn't be stressed enough in terms of what community groups are doing. I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but I want to leave time for others.
And Rob, I'll let you chime in on this question if you want to as well.
Sure. Thanks, Vanna. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Randava, and I'm a senior counsel with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And I cover a lot of different issues. You might call me a jack of all trades at the Leadership Conference, but I spent a lot of time in particular on housing and lending issues and immigration and a few others, over time. And I just want to, I'll start by, and I worked on Capitol Hill for about about 2.5 years before coming to the leadership conference, and that's where I really cut my teeth a lot on a lot of the legislative process. But I'll start out by saying, by just seconding what Seema said, that I mean, there's just no substitute for the experience that people outside the Beltway can bring to talk about how policies are actually working in real life. And so there's such a need for it. Among policymakers and then among national advocacy groups. I mean, it's something where we need to keep on being brought back in touch and seeing getting a better sense of how the policies that we're pushing for are actually affecting people or could affect people. Just touching on just on the question. One other thing that comes to mind, so I learned a lot, working on Capitol Hill, but I mean, I was not always a Washingtonian. And, one thing that, this is crazy, if you have a high pain tolerance, one thing that really helped me a lot was even before, when I was in school, just having C-SPAN on in the background. Not necessarily like focusing on it, but I mean, you learn so much by osmosis about process. And I mean, you learn, first of all, you get a better sense of who's actually in Washington and who's shaping policy, but then you learn a lot about procedures that, about, what suspension of the rules means and how bills, pass under that procedure. And under, you can learn a lot by just having committee hearings on in the background about how those operate and what the procedures are. And having that procedural knowledge gives you such a comfort level that, combined with the knowledge that you bring about the impact of the policies, just having that comfort level when you go talk to advocates. I mean, when you go talk to members of Congress, I think it really gives you a leg up and just like another level of confidence that you can bring. And so things like C-SPAN, I mean, just read. I mean, if you have time to read committee reports, to get a feel for how they're done. I mean, I talk to a lot of people in DC, like who work in DC in advocacy, who don't know a lot of these things. So just having some working knowledge is always immensely helpful. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robin. I see a comment here from Jody, one of our attendees. Procedure knowledge is so important to feeling comfortable. Knowing the procedures really well will also help in the preparation stages of your advocacy. Thank you so much for that, Jody. I agree. So moving along to the second question here, I know that we often focus on legislative when we're talking about advocacy. It's just one of the most common forms of advocacy. While it is important, it's not the only way to bring about change. What other avenues exist, and how can advocates influence those processes?
And I can start with that one. I mean, the most obvious one that comes to mind is just the rulemaking process. And this is basically taking, where the individual agencies are taking what Congress has enacted and the president has signed and they start filling in the details. And a lot of times that's just as consequential, if not more, in how they're going to interpret the law and then how they're going to handle the specifics that Congress left, delegated for the agencies to do. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, most laws are just, Congress anticipates that, yeah, we don't have the policy knowledge to work all this out. So that really falls on the agencies, and it's really important for stakeholders, sorry, to follow what those agencies are doing and to weigh in, throughout that process. Litigation, my organization doesn't litigate, but that's certainly, there's certainly an important role for that. Abby mentioned earlier on talking about lobbying corporations. And that's something, that a lot of our organizations in DC, I mean, we either have or we're on, advisory committees, that where we bring in businesses or we go to businesses and tell them, yes, this is a good idea, what you're doing, or no, this is a terrible idea and you're going to ruin your reputation. There's a lot of value in that. And, just building the relationships that come with that really helps a lot in legislative advocacy too, and administrative advocacy. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, if we've learned anything from the past year, the power of, the uprisings that happened last summer and really the impact it's had on the conversations that are happening on the Hill now. The Black Lives Matter movement and others really set a tone and, has now played out so that, reparations are being discussed in the halls of Congress for the first time. And so, I think that outside raising awareness of issues can be really impactful. The photos we had up before were of rallies that were happening in Washington, D.C. Those kinds of opportunities also bring attention to issues and then create a platform for policy making. Similarly, media work, doing op-eds on issues, as well as working with media to get stories covered, really can have a huge influence on again, setting a stage for actual policy making later, So I think for me, I've always thought of it as, what are the long-term visionary goals that you're trying to achieve? And then, in the moment, depending on the political climate, what are the opportunities you can push for? And, certainly, witnessing the change in leadership in Washington, D.C. twice now since I've been here, have seen major shifts in the, types of opportunities and how to do policy work depending on the climate and the issues you're working on.
Thank you both. And before I ask the next question, I want to remind folks to continue live tweeting. I'm seeing your tweets as they're coming through, and remember to use the hashtag Camp Prosperity. We will award a prize to the top tweeter at the end of today's webinar. So moving along here, keep things going, Rob. Moving along here, as a follow-up question to the one that I just asked, regulatory / administrative advocacy, we tend to use those two interchangeably. While important, can be intimidating for some. And I was once that advocate who was very intimidated by the regulatory process. What are some issues that are decided under agency rulemaking, and how can advocates influence that process? And I'm going to start with Seema.
Well, I think, in terms of the rulemaking process, there's a lot you can do. And again, depending on the political climate and who's reading the comments, there's a real opportunity to influence how policies are implemented. So, in the rulemaking process, essentially determines how policies and laws are implemented. And so there's opportunity to weigh in on how resources are allocated. Data, I know we're going to talk about in a minute. We've been able to have some impact in terms of how data is collected, which will have a longer term impact on how resources are allocated in the end. So, rulemaking is the public's opportunity to weigh in on how laws are being implemented very broadly. And so, we've tried different strategies of submitting, when there's an opportunity for public comment, if there's alignment across a coalition, you could work with your coalition partners to all submit individual comments in alignment of a broader issue. Or if there are differing opinions, it's an opportunity to really show the nuances and the impact that different choices policymakers are making will have on your community. So I feel like it's an opportunity to offer more detail or really push an issue that is on debate.
And if I could just add to that, like Seema said, the climate really determines a lot. In the past 4 years before this one, there were a lot of rules that the leadership conference had serious problems with, and the two things that we really focused on bringing were volume and diversity. And part of that's just just to have as many people just feeling heard, and just bringing out the nuances of issues. But then the agencies have to read all these comments, and they have to analyze them to some extent. I mean, they're required to under the Administrative Procedures Act, and sometimes it's in our best interest we know a rule, we know an agency has its mind made up to do something we don't like, and the least we can do is to bog them down with as many comments as we can. There was a rule that the Census Bureau proposed a few years ago dealing with citizenship questions, and we drove in as hundreds of thousands of comments in opposition to it, and that bought us some time. And the other thing is that making sure that the comments are as individual as possible. That's not always possible, but to the extent that it can be done, not everybody's going to have have expertise, but just writing things in your own voice can help, because they can be treated as unique comments, even if they're making similar arguments. Now, the flip side of that is when there's agencies that are run by people that are more in alignment with what we want, and sometimes we want to make it as painless as possible. A couple of years ago, the FDIC proposed changes to allow banks to hire people with past criminal convictions, and they wanted to make it easier for banks to do that. And we wanted, in return, to make it as quick of a process as we could. So I mean, there were a few just sign-on letters, from us and banking trade groups, all saying pretty similar things. That yes, this is a good thing. Please, go forward and try to get through that comment period as quickly as that common analysis period. We wanted to make that relatively short. So.
Yeah, if I could share another example, within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, we often push for data disaggregation, meaning, we're looking for more detailed data on racial groups so that we can really tell the story of the low-income parts of our community. And under the Obama administration, there was a rulemaking process on what data the federal government itself would collect. And we mobilized our community and submitted so many comments that they couldn't actually administer the rulemaking process because there were too many comments to get through. And by the time that was finished, the election happened and a new administration came in. So our strategy backfired in that case. We would have been better off, just submitting a few strong letters, giving our recommendations jointly.
Great. And speaking of submitting a few letters, I know that there's a lot of text on the screen, so I did want to remind people that, and if you'll go back a slide, I did want to remind people, if you want to screenshot this just to save this picture on the GoToWebinar screen that you're looking at the top, there's a button to screenshot it. So I wanted to give folks a second to do that if you wanted to keep this this graphic. And so while you all are doing that, I will move along to the next question here. And I can also, I guess, share this PDF. It's a great resource for national capacity that I can share with you all as well. The next question here, I know we've got about 12 more minutes before we open up for Q&A, but we've focused a lot on how to engage, but talk a little about the legislative process and when is the best time to engage. And if you could as well, just kind of discuss committees and sort of, influencing them, that whole thing. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, Rob, go ahead. Why don't you?
Okay, sure. Certainly earlier is better. And just a couple of thoughts here on that is, keep in mind that Congress hits the reset switch every 2 years. And like all legislation that hasn't been enacted gets wiped out and they have to start over. And even then, there's things get stalled because there's a long break in August, and there's elections that members have to worry about, and staff turns over, and a whole lot of other factors. I mean, I've seen groups take like a year and a half haggling over a bill just to get it introduced. And then, by then it's too late to actually do anything about it. And it's rare for a bill to get signed into law the first year that it's introduced, but it's something that, you have to grapple with how much time you want to spend on an ideal bill versus a weaker one that you can pass sooner is something, that's something to consider. In terms of, while we're talking about that, I would also touch on, who your champion is. You have to find a member that's going to be really invested in this particular bill. And I spent a few years working for Barney Frank, who became very invested in a bill dealing with immigration because of how it was affecting his district. And you find the right person like that, they're going to spend a lot of their own political capital trying to push for this legislation and bring it up in just conversations with other members. And so that's important. How you frame the bill is important, and sometimes some bills are easy. The Equality Act, discrimination is wrong, period. That's a little more simple, and we're on a little bit more of the offense side on that one. Whereas with other issues, sometimes you need to just spend some time with focus groups just to figure out, okay, how do we want to talk about this bill in a way that's going to make it really simple? And another thing is which groups you're working with in coalition. And sometimes the general rule is that more is better, but that's not always the case. And so I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Yeah. I guess I would just add, in terms of timing, some tools that have been helpful for me. One is the House publishes its calendar. So, that's something that's easy to download, and you can even add it to your Google Calendar, Outlook calendar, so you can see when voting is happening. So it also tells you when recess is occurring, though that's a good time to meet with elected officials in their district, usually when they're in district. And also staffers have a little bit more time when they're in recess. So, keeping an eye on the congressional calendar, and then also signing up for newsletters for the committees that are important to you. So for national capacity, we really want to pay attention to what the House and Financial Services Committee is doing. So just signing up for the newsletters of the chair and leadership there helps you keep track of what's happening and also what they're prioritizing. One benefit of COVID has been that things are happening virtually. You can watch hearings online as they're happening right now. So, hopefully some of those things will continue to happen. And there's, I feel like been a shift in greater transparency because some of those things have had to become more publicly available. For every hearing that they hold in Congress, there's also a memo that gets posted ahead of the hearing, so you can get a sense of how issues are being thought about and what policy solutions are being debated at that time. So it does take time, but if there's an issue that you're clear you want to push on, invest the time in doing the homework and getting that context. It'll really help inform who your targets are for your advocacy and how to frame your issues.
And one other quick thought, since Seema mentioned the calendar, the conventional practice is to always do all the lobbying, when Congress is in session. I would argue, and maybe this is just me, that I found that, when I was a Hill staffer, I was so much more receptive when people came in during recess and wanted to talk to me. And it's just, there's so much less going on. And I think it's probably true of other staffers. I mean, you're going to catch me in more casual attire, and there's, the member's not going to be there, and the phones aren't going to be ringing off the hook. And I mean, as a house staffer, I had to have a lot of meetings standing out in the hallway because because Barney Frank was in his office, and there were like 2 other meetings going on, in the lobby of the office, and you really want to get undivided attention of staffers. Try them during recess. Yeah. And maybe not the August recess, because that's when people really head out of town. But when there's a week-long break, that's a really good time to dive a little bit deeper with the staffer.
Thanks for adding that, Rob. And one thing that I always try to plug for our advocates too is not to ever neglect district offices, mostly because that's where I started my career several years ago in a congressional district office. And those offices are right there in your community. There are staffers there who will who can really help you interpret what's happening in Washington, in addition to passing along resources, thoughts, and stories that you have to the member of Congress. So I did want to plug that the district offices are critically important and often
absolutely
overlooked a lot of times as advocacy resources.
Yeah.
Want to squeeze in 2 more questions for you all. The next question is, we often talk about data and why it's so important in advocacy. Where can community-based organizations find local data, and how can they use data to tell the story of their community in a compelling way?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think so many issues, there really isn't, unfortunately, strong national data. So sometimes you have to create your own data, through community surveys and things like that. But, I would say some resources that were really helpful to me when I was working locally were really local planning departments, your municipalities, also, of course, think tanks, places like that do a lot of research, but sometimes you might want to challenge them. If you see a national data set that doesn't really reflect the reality of what's happening in your community, those are opportunities actually to raise awareness on issues if you can collect some local data and really challenge how that information is being presented. But then, we have, for those that are interested in the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we have quite a bit on our website, and I know a lot of our partners take a similar strategy to really try to help make data more available and digestible for local groups. So that's also another resource.
Yeah. And when a lot of it, data depends on what kind of issue you're working on and who you're presenting it to. When it comes to there's a lot of things where you can find. The Census Bureau has obviously tons of a variety of data, that might serve some issues. Other times I'll have to go on the Immigration Customs Enforcement Bureau's website for the specifics. But then keep in mind that sometimes it helps on one issue, and sometimes it's not necessarily going to move the needle on others. I think of this issue where I worked for Barney Frank on immigration, where there were a lot of people, very long-term residents who had green cards for years, who were getting deported for really old criminal convictions, very minor criminal convictions. I mean, there were cases where somebody came here as a child and got into a fist fight at the age of 18 and went on for another decade or 2 without ever getting into trouble again, and was facing deportation. Or somebody with a $15 shoplifting conviction, or somebody who sold a joint. Sometimes those little stories, I mean, when you illustrate them the right way and show show the real human consequences of the policies, sometimes that's more persuasive than numbers are. And sometimes the converse is true. I mean, the anti-immigrant crowd loves to, find somebody who really did something wrong and use that. And sometimes the numbers are. It's hard to overcome the emotional the emotional impact of some of the stories that that opponents can use. So just that caveat
Yep.
with the use of data.
Yep.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, I was just going to add, you know, sometimes just having one really strong data point is what you need. You know, very often we as advocates flood people with data points, and
Yes.
sometimes it's just one good point that you could make that will be enough.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree with
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
I've of course added screenshots from our Prosperity Now scorecard as well as data from National Capacity. Feel free to go to either of our websites to attendees to look through our data set, National Capacity's data set. Last question that I have here for the panelists, and then I'm going to open it up for audience questions because I see we've been having a steady amount of questions come through as the conversation has gone on. But we all know that there is a lot of noise in Washington. Many people are competing for the ear of legislators.
Mm-hmm.
For smaller organizations like those that we have on today's webinar with limited capacity sometimes, what advice do you have for getting started or taking their advocacy to the next level?
I mean, for me, you know, when I was working locally at a smaller organization, really it was partnering with National Capacity that helped us to elevate our issues. And so, you know, whether it's working in partnership with a national group or doing it independently, you know, I do think, you know, figure out who on your staff really can help be a spokesperson and help cultivate one or two community members who can work with you. You know, we as a small organization were able to have national impact, and that was because of the stories we were able to capture and the data points we were able to capture that then National Capacity helped us to amplify on a national level. And so, you know, one good press release can go pretty far if it's done the right way, you know, with the right partners in place. So I think putting a small amount of resources towards it makes a big difference, and getting your staff trained, you know, makes a big difference as well.
Mm-hmm. If I could add to that, one thing that I find almost always helpful is having strange bedfellows. And if you're in the same room with groups that you usually fight with on other issues, lobbying together on the same issue, that's really hard for policymakers to ignore. I mean, this really gets a lot. It really stands out. I mean, one of the best examples I can think of is in the past few years where civil rights groups and other groups working in criminal justice reform partnered with conservative religious groups, and to try to send the message from across the political spectrum that look, there are a lot of reforms needed to the penal system, and those kinds of things really go farther than they would on their own.
Yeah. I think working in coalition is probably one of the most effective ways to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and defining, where that one coalition that sometimes runs a little that has trouble is so I think of what was known as comprehensive immigration reform, where there's a huge range of stakeholders from immigrants, groups representing immigration communities, business groups, labor groups, and there was a lot that they all had in common. And sometimes, but at the same time, sometimes the things could break down over the details, where businesses might have a different priority when it comes to worker visa to employment visas that compared to labor unions. And I've seen legislation sometimes grind to a halt because the coalition gets a little too big.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you both. And at this time, I want to open up the floor and go to Q&A. We've got a lot of questions in the questions box from folks in the audience. And immediately after questions, we're going to do a pop quiz, as I mentioned earlier, just to incorporate some fun into today's webinar. But we haven't heard from, and I want to back up. for a second and thank Rob and Seema so much for that panel discussion. So much great information was shared. I thank you both for your time. Thank you, Abby, as well, for the great intro to today's session. You are always great and no stranger to Camp Prosperity, like I mentioned before. And speaking of Abby, I want to bring you back into the conversation because we have had another question here for you, and I thought it was a good question. What about advocating for budget appropriations? Is that considered lobbying?
Great question. And my answer, as my answer to so many things are, it depends. If you're advocating to the legislature about what goes in the state budget, for instance, that will be lobbying. So budget appropriations, budget authorizations, I always need a reminder on which is which, but working with trying to get the legislature to pass the budget or to increase funding for a program in the budget is likely going to be lobbying. If, on the other hand, money has already been sort of appropriated to a particular agency and you're looking at how that agency is going to spend their money, then it may be different. Because again, it's all about, are you dealing with the legislature?
Great, thank you, Abby. And I want to back up to a question that we had earlier. Any thoughts or resources on how to best engage residents so that they begin and continue to advocate for themselves? And before someone chimes in and answers this, I want to say this particular question may be answered in a lot more detail in our next Camp Prosperity session, Successful Allyship for Grassroots Advocacy. I think I have the title correct, where we're going to talk about just engaging the different types of allies in the community. But Seema, Rob, if you have any thoughts there, please feel free to chime in.
So
this is Abby. I have one thought. I mean, I think it's also, and as you had on the graphic a minute ago, you know, to remember that the policymakers are people too. And I think to remind people in the community that it's having a conversation and that they're there to talk about their issue, their problem, their concern, and they own that. And they're the best expert on what matters to them. And when if you're bringing somebody from the community to talk to a policymaker, they're calling a policymaker, participating in a Zoom lobby day, they don't need to understand the entire budget process. They don't need to know the difference between budget appropriations and budget authorizations. They need to know what their story is. And so I think reminding people that, again, you know, we all play a different role in the advocacy process, and we all don't need to be experts on everything, but we all have a lot to offer and that no one else can.
And this is Vanna. I'll chime in here as well. I would also encourage folks on the call who are direct service providers is the more you can, and this is just something that I found in my past community work and campaign work, the more that you can educate people on you know, the different types of issues that are affected by congressional decisions, that are affected by state legislative decisions. I think a lot of times people don't really see Congress or their state legislator as the source for change, or they don't really understand how the process works or the point of advocating. So I think the more that we can educate people on just sort of who has the ability to change things, who the ultimate decision maker in certain issues are, I think the better. I think that would be, you know, ground zero starting point for this type of engagement of residents, is just making sure that people have a baseline understanding of just sort of similar to this conversation today of like who needs to be influenced and sort of who has jurisdiction over the issues that are impacting our community. And I know that Prosperity Now has our advocacy toolkit that has resources for you all to get started, just very basic resources on just what advocacy is, why it's so important, you know, how to engage in the different types of advocacy. I'll stop there and yield to Seema or Rob if you had anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, you know, building a relationship over the long term makes a big difference, you know, continuing that education on an ongoing basis and not just a one-off meeting, so that, you know, when issues arise, you're able to build on that relationship you have in place. can make a big difference. In terms of educating a broader base of local residents on the process, I mean, there are many resources out there. The Indivisible Guide came out a few years ago, had it has a step-by-step on how you as an individual can engage in the process. That's a good resource. And then there are also a lot of apps these days. I've downloaded a few of them that, you can do searches by member of Congress, at a very low cost, or some are even free, just to keep yourself up to speed. But I think in terms of where to start, building a relationship with your local electeds and the offices, the staffers, is a really good place to start. And it can start with just education. You don't have to jump into a clear ask from the beginning. Eventually, hopefully you get there. But I think in the beginning, it can just be education,
Yeah.
I have another
Yeah,
question.
I was just, go ahead.
Right, yeah, let me get to another question. We have several.
Okay, you can go to the one. Sure.
Go back. But someone here is asking, what resources can be used to determine how legislators are leaning to help encourage or influence them and advocate? I sometimes feel like I'm late to the party.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think, some of those apps are very helpful. Going to the legislator's website, they usually list, what bills they've been championing. The committee websites, again, figure out which committees are important to you and monitor those sites to see, get a sense of how different elected officials are voting and leaning ahead of reaching out to their offices.
And just speaking up for my organization, we every session of Congress, we do voting records that break it down in a little bit more detail, and a whole lot of other groups do the same. You might find one, a national group that has a little bit more tailoring to what you're working on, and just look to see if they have those voting records and a lot of times we tend to get in a little bit into the weeds in our voting records, maybe for good, for better or worse. But you can that's another really helpful resource, I find.
And I'll also add Twitter as being a great resource. I don't know if anyone mentioned that, but especially over the last 4 or 5 years, it has just become a place for folks to sound off and talk very freely about where they're leaning on issues. So I would encourage that as well. And the Prosperity Now's Advocacy Center, I'm going to drop the link in the chat in a second. Our online advocacy center is also a tool for you to look up your legislator. And there's a bio section that talks a little bit about some of the things that the legislator has supported or opposed in the past. And it's federal, state, and local legislators you can look up. So I'll post that in the chat, but it's our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center. Let's see, another question here is, what is the most effective method to bring about change at the local or state level when historically the legislation has voted against the type of work that you are looking to change?
I can speak to that at the national level, but if other ones want to talk about the state level, go ahead.
I mean, I would just say on the, on the local and, particularly on the local level, I think, as elections are happening, having candidate forums, things like that can have a huge influence, and also make the candidates more accessible. So I think even starting from that early on, as people are running for office and asking them their positions, can really build accountability to local communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the national level, I mean, sometimes it's just, you're going to go into a hostile environment, but you're going to get points a lot of times for going in anyway. And if you go in with the understanding that we're on opposite sides of this issue, but wanted to talk to you about it anyway. Sometimes clever, creative solutions can emerge out of that. And but I mean, you will definitely. You'll generally not get shouted out of an office for going in with an opposing view. If you do it the right way, if you go in with the right level of diplomacy, then you're going to make a good impression, and that's always going to work in your advantage.
Great. Another question here is following up on the tips that you gave earlier. For very small organizations without a dedicated staff person to focus on advocacy, what activity would make the best use of our limited resources? Meeting with electeds, trying to build a broad coalition, tracking legislation. Any thoughts there?
I mean, I think coalition efforts are the way to go, for smaller organizations with limited capacity. If there is a clear issue that's impacting communities across the board and local organizations can come together around that issue, I think that's probably the best way to move something without it taking up too much time and energy. We as advocates have to find ways to tell our stories. If we're doing amazing work locally and helping individuals, but nobody knows about it, I think that's not really approaching the work the right way. We have to find ways to make the time to tell the stories, capture the data, so that we can get to systemic change. Otherwise, if we're just working in isolation and nobody knows about it, it doesn't have as much of an impact. So unfortunately, I know that's hard to hear for a small group that doesn't have a lot of resources, but I think it speaks to the importance of having diversity in your funding. If you're only funded by government grants, that can be very limiting. Need to find ways to raise resources that allow you to do the other parts of this work that brought most of us into the field in the first place, which is really, trying to advocate for justice for our communities.
Great. And Abby's been relatively quiet, so I'm going to bring her back into the conversation. We have a question here. Is there some reason that lobbying is bad? Can small CSA programs not do that?
Well, I love this question. And I think too often lobbying is often portrayed, particularly in the media, within organizations, as bad. Lobbying by itself is never, I don't think, should ever be seen as bad. Sometimes it's not the most appropriate tool. Sometimes it's not the useful tool at all, particularly if what we're talking about is some kind of policy change that doesn't require the legislature. So sometimes it's not needed. But I think what the questioner is really getting at is, are we allowed to do it? And again, and Seema was just talking about this, some funding streams do not allow their funding to be used for lobbying. So government grants, government contracts can't be used for lobbying. So you can't use government money to try to get government to change how they do something. So government contracts, government grants can't be used for lobbying. So you're not allowed to lobby with that money. Unfortunately, too many foundations restrict their funding and say, you can't use our money for lobbying. And so that funding is not available, which is why some organizations, are relying on bake sales, lemonade stands to be able to fund their lobbying work. And so it's not so much of whether lobbying is good or bad. It's, do you have the funding available that you can spend on it, and is it needed? And I think part of my job and why I've been doing this work for so long and keep doing it is really trying to dispel the myth that lobbying by itself is bad, or that lobbyists are bad, and that it's an inherently inappropriate thing or unseemly type of activity. It's really, really vital. And thinking about, again, whether it was the Paycheck Protection payment loans that were critical to saving organizations, whether it's getting the baby bond bill passed that will be a life changer for so many kids, whether thinking about all of the laws that have been passed over, the history of this country, recognizing how important it is. And sometimes that ask, sometimes that please support this is what's needed to get it over the finish line. So lobbying, and even if you're not the group that can lobby, so maybe your organization doesn't have the unrestricted funds, there's some other organization that can. And so it may not be, so if we don't think about it as good or bad, but think about it as can we do it or not, may be a better way or a different way to frame it. I'll get off my soapbox now and turn it back to Vanna.
Thank you for that great and thorough answer. Another question here. Are there some basic educational tools about how the legislative process works, in parentheses, at the federal and state levels, that we to educate ourselves to how our political process works, as well as to inform our constituents or residents, particularly easy to understand tools?
I could start. I learned a lot just like through such a wide variety of sources. But to the extent that you can, like I said before, just having C-SPAN on in the background. While you're doing other work, you don't have to pay. And certainly don't when they start the viewer call-ins, just ignore those because those are crazy. But just the actual floor proceedings, you really learn a lot just by listening casually to it while it's going on. And in terms of the learning the strategy, there's one mercifully short book that I could recommend. It's called Winning the Inside Game, and it's by, and I'll spell the name here, it's Ilir Zerka, I-L-I-R, and the last name is Z-H-E-R-K-A. And Ilir was the head of an organization called DC Vote, which has, for years been involved in the push for statehood for DC and, or congressional representation for DC. And it's just a pretty quick primer on how to go about doing advocacy, just from a variety of angles. It really draws on his own experience, but I think it's a pretty good, concise book.
Yeah. And, I would just add, definitely do your homework and go in with, some preparation, but don't let that deter you from not just jumping in and learning too. I think there's a lot to be said for, getting your feet wet and trying it out and learning as you go. So I think too many of us feel like we have to have everything figured out and are intimidated by, the process and the language. And, don't let that get in the way of setting up a meeting and starting a conversation.
Mm-hmm. And like was said before, remember the staffers are people too. And, go in there, listen as much as you're talking. When they feel heard, you're going to feel heard too in return.
Thank you for that, Rob. And I'll say this in closing because I want to move on to the pop quiz and next steps. But whoever asked the question, I added a link to Prosperity Now's advocacy toolkit in the chat. I think we still have a video that's from like Schoolhouse Rocks that is very basic, like the legislative process. It's funny, but in all seriousness, please use that. It's an advocacy toolkit. So the link is in the chat. So I would say start there, as well as other resources within our advocacy toolkit. It's just a good resource for you. And then someone here is asking, and I'm going to answer really briefly, what are your thoughts about the child tax credit direct payments being made permanent? It'll be a game changer, Claudia. That's something that Prosperity Now is 100% behind. It's one of our advocacy priorities right now. I'm not going to really speak to more on it. We've got blogs on our website, so I would just encourage you to go to prosperitynow.org, search child tax credit, and you'll see just sort of some of the things that we've written on the issue. But I agree, it would be a game changer. We are fully supportive. Okay, now to the fun stuff. Thank you all so much for the the thoughtful questions. Thanks to our panelists for the answers. It looks like we have a Twitter winner announced here. And it looks like it is whoever is running the NAACP Alabama Economic Development Twitter account. You all have, you know, I guess sent out the most tweets or been the most active throughout the series. If you would drop your email address for whoever is running that account into the chat box, we will send you out a prize from Prosperity Now. Secondly, as you all see on the screen, it is pop quiz time, my favorite part of Camp Prosperity here. So the question that we have for the pop quiz, and just so you all know, after I ask the question, the first person to type the answer into the questions box specifically, so type the answer into the questions box, you will receive a prize from Prosperity Now. So the question is, drum roll please, true or false, lobbying is a type of advocacy? As always, we get an explosion of responses as soon as we answer that. And it looks like Molly, I saw your answer first. Molly Cassidy, I'm not sure where you're from, but you are today's pop quiz winner. We'll have 2 pop quizzes on the next Camp Prosperity. So for those of you who didn't win today, we will have an opportunity to win next week, as well as if you fill out the survey, you'll have an opportunity to win a prize, and then tweeting next week as well. So Kesia Hendricks, it looks like you won for Twitter, and then Molly Cassidy, if you'll send your email address along, we'll get you out a prize from Prosperity Now. So with that, I'm going to move us along to some next steps for you all and just kind of close us out here. One is first and foremost, make sure you all have information for today's speakers. So you have Abby, Seema, and Rob's information there if you want to follow up with them via email, especially Abby. I know that some of you had very specific questions about your organization, so please feel free to reach out to Abby. And then on the next slide here, you can see some quick next steps. Please fill out the survey, the post-webinar survey. Again, it's incentivized. You will have an opportunity to win a prize. We'll draw a name from those survey completions. Next Camp Prosperity webinar in the series is going to focus on successful allyship and grassroots advocacy. It's going to take place in 2 weeks on July 13th. And it's going to cover exactly what the title says there, successful allyship. We often get asked, you know, we talk about coalition building a lot, but, you know, the little things that make up coalition building, you know, resource sharing, how to decide on, come together and decide on which issues to focus on, resolving conflicts within allyships in the community. So all of those different types of things will be covered in that next webinar. And then our final webinar on July 27th will cover advocating for racial equity and policy. So we've got 2 very great webinars coming up, and I hope that you all will stay with us throughout Camp Prosperity. And then lastly, I just invite you all to explore the Prosperity Now website for resources, events, so on and so forth. I know that we dropped a number of links in the chat box, so feel free to go through those and visit our website. Next slide, you'll see just our Prosperity Now community. As always, we invite you all, if you have interest beyond advocacy and want to connect with folks on some programmatic work in addition to advocacy, we have a number of different community networks that you can join. For instance, Health and Wealth, Taxpayer Opportunity, Racial Wealth Equity Network. Go to our website. You can see the link there at the bottom of your screen for how to join those. And then a couple other things, our Prosperity Now campaigns, we have 4 issue areas that we cover: home ownership, consumer protections, safety net, and then our tax campaign, which is called Turn It Right Side Up. These are both federal and state campaigns. So if you want to get involved more to see how to take action, I know a lot of your organizations are super new to advocacy. So if you want an easy way to involve yourself, we do all the work here at Prosperity Now. We just ask that you take action on it. It'd be a really great way, an easy way to involve yourself. Go to the website there at the bottom to join our advocacy campaigns. And then lastly, I know that I had included a link to our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center, a quick way, a tool that you all can use to send an email to a member of Congress, call a member of Congress, tweet at them, schedule a meeting with them, or sign a petition. You can do all of that through our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center. Feel free, it's free to all of our network members. Go in anytime, send an email to a member of Congress, call them, do whatever you want. Look up information about the committees that they serve on. You can see we got Tim Kaine there on the screen, a little bit more about some of the issues that he's supporting. But it's just a great tool for you all if you don't have a similar tool within your respective networks. And I see my chat button is flashing, so I'm going to pull this out to make sure I'm not missing anything. And if not, we can go to the next slide here. And I just want to again thank Seema, Rob, and Abby for an excellent presentation today. I hope that everyone on the call learned a lot. I hope you got your questions answered. The recording for this session will be made available online on our Camp Prosperity website, within Prosperity Now's website. But again, thank you so much, Seema, Rob, Abby, and thank you to all of our attendees. We will see you in 2 weeks on July 23rd to talk about successful allyship. So you all have a great rest of your afternoon.